What happens when a billionaire's arrogance meets the quiet strength of a man who's had enough? In a world where money buys everything, one waiter's courage forces an entire room to rethink what true power really is. Brace yourself for a story that will challenge your beliefs, make you question authority, and inspire you to stand tall in the face of adversity. Are you ready to discover the real price of respect? The evening sky outside was a deep shade of indigo, casting a soft, cool glow over the city. Manhattan, as always, buzzed with the energy of 1,000 lives intertwining. But in the upscale restaurant of the city's elite, all eyes were on one table, Elizabeth Ashford's table. She sat at the heart of the room, surrounded by her circle of high-powered friends, each one trying to keep up with her sharp wit and biting humor. With platinum blonde hair, a sleek black dress, and a piercing gaze, Elizabeth was the epitome of a self-made billionaire. At 47, she had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from the ground up, a feat few could claim. But as she sipped her wine, her icy exterior betrayed the quiet toll her success had taken on her soul. The world had watched as Elizabeth conquered industries, beat competitors into submission, and rose to the top of the corporate ladder. Yet behind her confident smile was a woman who had sacrificed everything: her relationships, her compassion, and sometimes even her humanity. She was no longer the woman who dreamed of success. She had become the embodiment of it, and with that came an untold coldness, a sharpness that kept others at a distance. She was used to being admired, feared, and even envied. What she wasn't used to was being questioned. Across the room, Michael Grant stood in the kitchen, his thoughts a swirl of nerves and determination. At 28, Michael had been working at this restaurant for a year, hoping it would be a stepping stone to something greater. He had aspirations, dreams bigger than serving wine to Manhattan's rich and powerful, but for now, he worked quietly, hoping one day his hard work would pay off. Michael was a man of few words, a quiet observer of the world around him. He had learned to navigate the complexities of a world that often overlooked people like him. A black man in a predominantly white, upper-class environment, Michael had faced his share of challenges. Disrespect was not new to him. But tonight, as he approached Elizabeth's table with the wine, something in the air felt different. She sat there as though the world belonged to her, and yet something about her presence unsettled him. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, as though he was just another object to be dismissed. "Good evening, ma'am," he greeted her with a smile, his voice steady, though his hands betrayed him with a slight tremor. Elizabeth didn't even look up. "About time," she snapped, her eyes still focused on the glass in her hand. The coldness in her voice stung like ice. Michael took a deep breath. He had heard that tone before, the tone that tried to diminish him, to reduce him to nothing. But as the words left her lips, something inside him shifted. Would he let her continue? Would he remain invisible forever? The conflict was about to ignite, not just between two people, but between two worlds. The room was tense as Michael walked back to the kitchen, his thoughts racing. The words from Elizabeth still echoed in his mind, sharp and biting. About time. The disdain in her voice had been unmistakable, and it was something he had endured countless times before. But tonight it felt different, more cutting, more personal. As he filled his tray with the next round of orders, his hands shook slightly. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, but he had never felt it so deeply. In the back of his mind, a question gnawed at him. Why do I let people like her make me feel this way? Michael had grown up on the streets of Brooklyn, where success was often defined by survival rather than achievement. He had fought for every inch of his dignity, and he had learned the hard way that the world didn't always recognize or respect people like him. As a young man of color, Michael had seen firsthand the barriers that wealth and privilege built to keep certain people at the bottom. But he had worked hard to rise above, to build something for himself, and he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Elizabeth Ashford, make him feel small. He returned to Elizabeth's table, trying to push the emotions building inside him to the back of his mind. But as he set the wine glass down, she spoke again, her voice dripping with condescension. "Do you even know how to do your job properly?" She sneered, her eyes never leaving her phone screen. The words hit Michael like a slap, and he felt a surge of anger flood his chest. It wasn't just about the disrespect, it was about the fact that people like Elizabeth thought they could walk all over people like him. His heart pounded and he took a steady breath, trying to calm the rising storm inside him. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to keep his head down and do his job without any more conflict. But deep inside, something was shifting. What if this is the moment, he thought. What if I don't let her get away with it this time? Michael had always believed in doing his job well, staying professional and keeping his head down. But tonight, the philosophy was starting to feel more like a prison than a path to success. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Michael began, his voice calm but firm. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." Elizabeth's gaze snapped up to meet his, her face hardening. The table fell silent. It was as though time itself had paused. The tension was electric. The room seemed to shrink as every eye in the restaurant turned to witness what would happen next. Michael felt the weight of every gaze, every judgment, but his mind was made up. This was the moment of change. This was where I stand up, no matter the cost. The silence between them stretched, suffocating. Elizabeth's lips curled into a tight smile. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice sharp. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a momentary crack in the wall of her arrogance. Michael didn't back down. "I'm more than just your waiter. You don't get to treat me like I'm less than you," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of silent frustration. For the first time, Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. Her eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Something was changing. Michael didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a turning point. The silence between Michael and Elizabeth was thick, almost suffocating, as though the entire restaurant had frozen in time. Michael's heart hammered in his chest, his breath steady but shallow. He hadn't expected to feel this much tension, this much weight. But now that the words had been spoken, there was no turning back. It felt as though the world was watching them, the billionaire woman, accustomed to her power, and the waiter, a man who had silently endured the degradation of his position for too long. Elizabeth didn't speak immediately, her eyes fixed on Michael as though she were trying to decipher him. For a moment she seemed almost lost. The icy arrogance that usually defined her was replaced by something entirely different, something more human, more vulnerable. Michael could feel it, that crack in her armor. Could this be the beginning of something new? He wondered. For years, Elizabeth had lived her life behind walls, building them higher and higher with each victory, each achievement. She had become a fortress, impenetrable and proud. But in this small moment, facing a young man who dared to challenge her, something shifted. There was something in Michael's eyes, a quiet strength that disarmed her. It wasn't his anger that took her off guard, but his calm, his unwavering sense of self. Elizabeth started, her voice faltering for the first time that night. "I didn't mean..." Her words trailed off as she searched for something to say, something to regain control. She wanted to snap back, to reclaim her power, but something held her back. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't the one in control of the situation. Michael watched her closely, sensing the hesitation in her. This was his moment. His heart still raced, but the rush of adrenaline wasn't fear anymore, it was clarity. He knew now that he didn't need to explain himself to her or anyone else. He didn't need her approval. He didn't need to shrink to fit into the tiny box society had created for people like him. "You didn't know me," Michael repeated, his voice firm yet calm. "And you don't get to define me." Elizabeth's gaze softened for a brief moment, as if she were seeing him for the first time. In that quiet exchange, Michael understood something profound. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity. He was fighting for every person who had been silenced, overlooked, and made to feel invisible. He had broken through the barrier between them, and it felt like he had unlocked something inside her as well. The moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken words. Michael was beginning to realize that his act of defiance wasn't just about standing up to Elizabeth, it was about standing up for himself. And for the first time, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride, as though he were walking on a path that led to something greater than just this night. Elizabeth sat back, the defiance in her posture replaced by a reluctant understanding. Maybe you're right, she said, her voice quieter now, the edge gone from her tone. I've been wrong, and for that I apologize. Michael didn't expect the apology, but what mattered was the shift. For the first time, she had seen him not as a servant, not as a lesser, but as a person. And that realization, that moment of mutual respect, was a victory Michael hadn't anticipated but deeply needed. The tension that had consumed the room seemed to dissipate, and with it, something new blossomed in Michael's chest, a sense of hope. He had stood tall. He had faced down the beast, not with anger or aggression, but with quiet strength and dignity. It was the kind of victory that resonated beyond this moment. As Michael turned away, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. This battle wasn't over, but he had taken the first step. And in doing so, he had discovered a truth that would carry him through many challenges to come. Your voice matters. You are not invisible. But as he walked away, something caught his, a slight shift in Elizabeth's demeanor. There was more to this moment than either of them had yet realized. The room was a silent battlefield now, with every pair of eyes locked on Michael and Elizabeth. The air felt dense, heavy with unspoken thoughts and uncertain futures. The tension had reached its peak, and what had begun as a minor confrontation now stood at the precipice of something much larger. Michael could feel it, the weight of what he had just said, the magnitude of what had happened. Elizabeth had apologized, yes, but the road to real change wasn't as simple as that. This moment had the potential to unravel everything he had known about respect, dignity, and the power. Dynamics between the rich and the poor, the privileged and the disenfranchised. Elizabeth sat in stunned silence, her earlier pride gone. The woman who had been feared in every boardroom, every luxury event, was now a mere mortal, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. It was a crack in her perfect armor, and it made her question everything she had worked so hard to build. For the first time, Elizabeth wasn't sure of herself. She wasn't sure of her place in this moment, and that uncertainty was unsettling. Michael, on the other hand, felt something rise in him that he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose. The power that had always been wielded against him by people like Elizabeth was shifting, but there was no time to revel in it. The restaurant felt too small, the stakes too high. This wasn't just about one woman's apology, it was about all the times he and others like him had been silenced. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, their judgment waiting for him to falter, to shrink back into his role. It would have been so easy to do just that, to nod and accept her apology with a polite smile and move on. But in that moment, Michael knew that he couldn't go back to the way things had been. He couldn't let this chance slip by. He couldn't let the cycle of disrespect continue. "Thank you for your apology," Michael said, his voice calm but resolute. "But it's not enough to just say the words. The world doesn't change with apologies alone. It changes when we stand up and recognize each other for who we truly are." Elizabeth's eyes widened as she absorbed his words. The Ice Queen, so accustomed to being untouchable, was now confronting the most vulnerable part of herself. She was no longer the invincible billionaire. She was simply a woman who had been forced to see the truth people were not to be reduced to the roles she had assigned them. They were human, all of them, deserving of dignity. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. No longer was it the hushed murmur of the rich and powerful looking down on the invisible workers around them. The diners were witnessing a shift in power, and no one knew how it would end. Would Elizabeth regain her composure and retaliate? Or would she finally see the man in front of her as an equal? The words hung in the air, and in that moment, Elizabeth looked Michael in the eye, really looked at him, and saw the person he had become, the person who wouldn't back down, no matter how high the odds were stacked against him. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice small now. Not the commanding tone of the woman who had just moments before tried to make him feel small. Michael paused. The answer wasn't easy, nor was it about getting something from her. But it was a moment of reckoning. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "I want you to understand that I'm not your servant. I'm not here to serve your every whim. I'm here because I have dignity. And you should recognize that." For a brief moment, Elizabeth looked lost, then slowly her expression softened. She knew what was happening, and she knew the stakes had never been higher for both of them. The room had gone completely still, holding its breath. Everything had built to this moment, one simple conversation, one brave stand against everything that had come before. And in that silence, something clicked, something that wouldn't be easily forgotten by anyone present. Elizabeth had been brought to a crossroads. Would she continue on the path of dominance and control, or would she embrace this unsettling new understanding of herself and others? The decision she would make in the next few moments could change everything. The stakes had never been higher for either of them. But in this moment, Michael had already won. Not by dominating, not by overpowering, but by showing that the real power lay in standing up for yourself, no matter who was watching. The game had changed. And no matter the outcome, Michael would never be the same again. The restaurant, once a place of opulence and quiet murmurs, now buzzed with an invisible energy. Michael stood there, his heart still racing but filled with a new sense of purpose. Elizabeth, the formidable billionaire, had been forced to reckon with the reality of her own actions. The facade she had built around herself was beginning to crumble, piece by piece, in the light of Michael's quiet defiance. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving Michael. Her earlier coldness was gone, replaced by something much more vulnerable, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She wasn't the untouchable tycoon anymore. In this brief exchange, she had been stripped of her superiority, and in that moment, she had to face the uncomfortable truth. People weren't defined by their jobs, their wealth, or their status. They were defined by their humanity. Michael's heart slowed, and for the first time that evening, he felt the weight on his shoulders lift. He had come into the restaurant as just another waiter, but now he was standing as an equal. An equal to Elizabeth Ashford, to every other person in the room who had looked down on him, dismissed him, or failed to see him. In that quiet, charged moment, he realized something profound. He had already won. Not in the way he had expected, not by fighting or by demanding things from her, but by claiming his own dignity. He had stood up for himself, for all the people like him who had been silenced, overlooked, or unseen. Elizabeth, still processing what had happened, finally broke the silence. "You're right," she said, her voice softer than before. "I've spent my whole life believing that my success meant I could treat people however I pleased, but maybe I've been wrong." The words were genuine, though hesitant. She wasn't used to this kind of humility, but there was a change in her now, a change she couldn't deny. Michael didn't expect an apology, nor did he need one. What mattered was the acknowledgement, the recognition that people weren't just tools to be used. They had worth beyond their jobs, their titles, and their wealth. And that was a truth Elizabeth had to face. "Thank you," Michael said simply, his voice steady. "That's all I've ever wanted, respect, for all of us." A long pause followed, as if both of them were waiting for the weight of those words to sink in. Slowly, Elizabeth nodded. "I will do better, I promise." The room, which had been thick with tension, now seemed to exhale collectively. The patrons around them, who had been watching in silence, began to murmur among themselves. For the first time, the dynamics of the restaurant had shifted. It wasn't just about wealth or status anymore. It was about the human connection that transcended all that. It was about respect and understanding. As Michael turned to leave, his heart light and his mind clear, he realized that this night had changed him. He hadn't just challenged Elizabeth Ashford, he had challenged the very notion that people like him were meant to remain invisible. He had found his voice, and in doing so had found his strength. And in the process, he had given Elizabeth a gift she hadn't known she needed, the chance to see the world and people differently. The moral of the story was simple, yet profound. True power isn't in dominating others. It's in standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. Michael had shown that respect isn't something you demand through force. It's something you earn by recognizing the worth of others and standing firm in your own. As Elizabeth sat in her chair watching him leave, she realized that she would never forget the lesson she had learned tonight. Respect, dignity, and humanity were the true measures of success, and Michael had taught her that in the most unexpected way. The restaurant had witnessed something rare, a moment of truth and a lesson in how to be truly human. And so, the story of Michael and Elizabeth comes to a close, but the lesson lingers. True strength isn't about wealth or power. It's about standing tall when the world tells you to shrink. It's about recognizing your worth and demanding respect, not through arrogance but through quiet dignity. Michael's journey teaches us that we all have the power to break the chains of invisibility, to challenge the status quo, and to redefine what it means to be truly successful. If this story inspired you, made you think about the power of respect, or reminded you that your voice matters, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey of transformation. Share this story with others who need a reminder of their own strength and the power of standing up for what's right. Let's keep the conversation going together. We can change the world, one story at a time. Subscribe for more powerful stories and inspiring content. You don't want to miss what's coming next.